Thank you, Eric. It's now my pleasure to introduce entrepreneur and cyber expert Amit Yoran. He's the chairman and chief executive officer of Tenable. Before that, Amit was president of the RSA, the founder and CEO for the market-leading network forensic product provider NetWitness, and the founding director of the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team program in the Department of Homeland Security. Amit has tackled the cybersecurity challenge from every possible angle over the last 2 decades. That's both inside and outside of government. His perspective on CMMC and cybersecurity is sought out across the globe, so we're very fortunate to have him here today. You've likely seen Amit on CNBC, Bloomberg, and many other national media outlets. Today, we'll listen in on a conversation with Amit and Cybersheath CEO Eric Noonan. Cybersheath is recognized as the leading managed CMMC compliance company. The company's experience stretches all the way back to 2008. That's when all of this started as a voluntary pilot program. In his former position as the BAE Systems Chief Information Security Officer, Eric was one of the very first members of the Department of Defense pilot program to secure their commercial supply chain. He testified before Congress on how those efforts would impact defense contractors, and we thought it would be enlightening to marry the Cybersheath perspective with the transformational leadership experience that Amit has into a facilitated conversation. We hope you enjoy this session with Cybersheath CEO Eric Noonan and Tenable CEO Amit Yoran.
Great. Amit, thanks so much for joining us here at CMMC Con 2021. Let's jump right in. You have a fascinating background, and I think you've uniquely seen cybersecurity problem from every angle. You have the rare combination of military, intelligence community, private sector perspective on the space. So really, I think our audience would greatly benefit from understanding how you see all the changes in the regulatory environment today. So from cybersecurity maturity model certification, President Biden's executive order on cybersecurity, all the other legislative initiatives, there seems to be very meaningful change across the federal government to force private sector investment in cybersecurity. So from where you sit, is that true? Is the United States finally getting serious about cybersecurity?
I think we're in an incredibly exciting point in the cybersecurity market, in the cybersecurity landscape, a real tectonic shift where for the first time ever, really, corporate leadership, government leadership, folks in the executive branch on the Hill, regulators, legislators, and corporate America are starting to really care about cybersecurity. You're seeing cybersecurity front and center in the mainstream media week in, week out, breaches, losses, problems, issues, outages of supply chain, food supply chain, pipeline, oil and gas, and other things. And so for the first time, leadership are recognizing that cybersecurity risk is an integral part of operations, an integral part of business risk. And so when that happens, you get attention. When you get attention like that, action occurs. And so for the first time, I've got a tremendous amount of optimism that we're going to start tackling these issues head on.
I love that. I think it's a great point, the alignment piece, right? The alignment of the private sector with the alignment of the federal government. It is unique, and I appreciate the optimistic tone because so much of cyber can be gloom and doom, but I think there is a lot to be optimistic about. One of the things that I think is a ray of hope across this industry and for our country meaningfully is the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So as you know, it creates mandatory minimum cybersecurity standards that every federal contractor, at least within the Department of Defense, must meet or they literally can't capture Department of Defense related revenue. Is that a draconian way of doing business and enforcing those mandatory minimums, or is it just a common sense approach in this day and age?
Listen, I think it's an absolutely necessary and a common sense approach to have at least minimum standards. Minimum standards help assure a baseline of not only compliance, but a baseline of capability and maturity that's required to responsibly address the minimum requirements around cyber. What is more foundational? So I think it's terrific. Yes, let's establish a baseline. Let's make sure everyone gets to that baseline. But let's make sure that everybody doesn't just gravitate toward the baseline. What we're really looking for, what's really required, is a level of visibility, a level of understanding and ultimately a level of accountability. And that's not to say we're going to be able to stop every potential attack and every potential breach which is going to occur. But if we can establish standards of care, if we can establish what negligence looks like in terms of managing your systems, managing your processes, acting responsibly when it comes to cybersecurity, then I think we really start raising the bar on a long-term basis.
I think that's a great point. The idea, and I think it's often a misguided knee-jerk response, is there'll be an attack, and then instantly the detractors of whatever standard, be it the executive order or CMMC, will say, well, would CMMC have stopped that attack? Would the executive order have stopped that attack? And I think what I heard you say is, we're not going to stop every attack, but we can establish minimum standards of care, what negligence looks like. And so it sounds like you think we are moving in the right direction.
We're going to stop what are today a majority of the attacks. And that's incredibly important for two reasons. One is we start reducing the losses. Two is we start upping the game, requiring that those that really want to breach us start using much more sophisticated techniques. And so when you reduce the noise, finding that signal, finding who the sophisticated adversaries are, the people who are doing the really complex stuff, starts becoming a lot easier. And so are we going to stop everything? Definitively, no. Are we going to stop a lot? Hell yeah. And we're going to make it a lot easier for us to identify those sophisticated breaches when they do occur.
Yeah, and there's a whole ecosystem out there, I think, when we can share that intelligence and reporting to get actionable and meaningful information into the hands of the operators who can use it most. But I think many Americans would actually, be very surprised to know that prior to CMMC, defense contractors could self-attest to cybersecurity, literally say, trust us, we've got this. We saw the attack on Colonial Pipeline. We saw the Florida water treatment plant attack. So much of the critical infrastructure run by private industry in this country is largely, in many ways, unregulated, doesn't have those baselines that we talked about. So given that as a context for our critical infrastructure, what do you think the most impactful set of actions we could take as a country to change that, to better protect our critical infrastructure?
Yeah, I think things like CMMC really step up everybody's game. I know you may sort of poo-poo the self attestation, but even that is a step up from what exists in most of the private sector today. I would love to see greater transparency, the same way public CEOs and CFOs have to attest to their, the integrity of their financial statements. I think it would be a terrific step forward to attest to that they're implementing cyber risk management as part of the risk management practices. I think that would drive a level of inspection and accountability that has not existed to date in most of corporate America, and especially in critical infrastructures. And of course, you can continue to take that up through moving from self-attestation, self-assessment and attestation to more mature practices like CMMC.
Yeah, and I think the key with self-attestation is actually the submission, like submitting your taxes, right? If I kind of do my taxes at home, but no one ever gets to see them, a little less scrutiny and maybe value, but the self-attestation that's actually submitted and validated, I think that's a key step that's been missing for a long time. Going back to President Biden's executive order on cybersecurity, it mandates within 120 days of the May date it was issued, basically minimum standards for all of the federal government. And so this kind of patchwork of inconsistent and differently enforced standards across all these government agencies will, and it was a very specific executive order, as you know, will change here within a 120-day period. So within 4 months, the largest supply chain in the world, which includes many hundreds of thousands of large and small privately held businesses, will at least have a standard to achieve and aspire to. How big a deal is that for you, given the kind of potential impact?
I know I expressed a tremendous amount of optimism earlier about the progress we're making or could make here very shortly in cyber. Listen, I don't know that the federal government and its entire supply chain is going to move with the 120-day agility that's been laid out in the executive order, and nor do I think it is important to achieve 100% compliance on that day. But what is important is that we've got a very clear shot across the bow that says, this is the direction we're going, and this is the type of pace that we're setting. And if you want to participate in this marketplace, then you're going to have it to accomplish and achieve these things. And so I think it's a terrific step forward. And I think it's the type of action and statement to the market that we really needed to see.
And you've seen it really kind of it all, right? Over the course of your career, I touched on it earlier, the good, the bad, and the ugly in cybersecurity from many different angles. So for the companies that are really getting cybersecurity right, the ones that are doing the things that set them apart from others, what are the things? What is it all? Is it all about the amount they spend, the resources that they dedicate to cybersecurity? What is it that the companies you see are doing things right are doing? Is there a common denominator?
The one common denominator, and some spend a lot of money and have a lot of personnel and a lot of energy and effort, and there's other companies which spend far less. But to me, there's a very clear delineation between those companies whose executive leadership place an emphasis on cybersecurity and really drive a cybersecurity culture and mindset through the entire company, and those that don't. And it doesn't have a price tag, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're spending X on cybersecurity products and you're doing Y. What it is it's a culture which says, hey, we care about the integrity of our systems. We're going to take the time to patch them and manage them. We're not going to rush out and roll the next feature functionality without really looking at it from an integrity perspective. And when you have that culture and mindset from the top, it really drives into the organization. And it starts with simple things like making sure folks don't have administrative privileges, making sure folks have multi-factor authentication, making sure people realize that there are hoops that they have to jump through when they use their systems and when they deploy new capabilities. And it's not because management's trying to be draconian. It's because the integrity of the systems and the company's brand and reputation and the data, the customer's data that they're managing is incredibly important and integral to the organization's ethos. And when you have that culture established and that tone set from the top, it really has a huge impact between, what I characterize as the cyber haves and the cyber have-nots.
No, I think that's a great point. I mean, without that executive support and leadership, you're just not going to get there for any effort that's important to an organization. You mentioned some fundamental things, really some kind of basic cybersecurity hygiene around multi-factor authentication. And, so many of the things I think that are in CMMC, the executive order, have been around for a long time, really are basic cybersecurity hygiene, but have largely been to some degree, unimplemented by the masses. And so do you think that this is, clearly it's a complex space, but do you think that many of the things we could be doing are actually fundamentally not that complex, like multi-factor authentication and whole disk encryption and some of the cybersecurity basics, and we just haven't got around to it?
Well, I think that's just it. The things that are required, right, are the basic building blocks for responsible behavior. It's the anti-malware things. It's the multi-factor authentication things. It's the system hygiene things. And those are the foundational building blocks for responsible behavior. And they aren't rocket science. And there are easy, well understood best practices for how to do these. Now, it's easy for me to sit here on in a video session and say, "Oh, just do it." When you're running a large and complex environment, obviously patching, updating, tightening system configuration, especially for a lot of antiquated legacy systems, can be extremely cumbersome. Can be quite painful. But the truth of the matter is, that's what managing IT systems is. You've got to pay attention to the details. You've got to do these basic things. And if you do those basic things really well, I want to say you're 100% secure, but it would be an exceptionally sophisticated and rare attack that would compromise you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So much of this is really kind of the fundamentals, and much of the attention often goes to these complex, very targeted attacks, but really it's kind of the masses that haven't implemented the basic measures that we're talking about that I think would have the greatest impact. On the legislative front, a lot is being done. And I really think in my lifetime, the most I've ever seen, and the alignment you talked about between private industry and federal government, it is pretty incredible. Is there anything else you think the government could be doing on that front legislatively that they aren't doing yet or could be doing better?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. I think, as you suggested, we're making a tremendous amount of progress and at a faster pace than we've seen at any other point in history. To me, the biggest long-term foundational driver around cybersecurity is transparency, right? In order for, there are no such thing as purely free markets, but in order for free markets to work, you have to have a certain degree of transparency around what best practices look like, transparency around what minimum standards look like, transparency around what risk and breaches look like and are occurring, and how organizations are responding to them, and ultimately that will help you determine what works and what doesn't work in the market. And so the one thing that I think is still an area where we can make significant improvement from a legislative standpoint is driving a higher degree of transparency into the market so that investors, customers, suppliers, and providers can really do a better job of assessing, what the risk levels look like, what's working and what's not. And I think that type of transparency in data sets will help the market establish a much stronger equilibrium than we've seen historically.
And do you think, Amit, that transparency is driven by a specific set of metrics, or are there things, as you were talking, it made me think of healthcare and sometimes the lack of transparency around pricing and options, and how consumers often in the healthcare space don't even see the price to be able to price shop. And as you were talking, made me think about cybersecurity, and there isn't a common way to measure things, which then leads itself to less transparency. Are there some things in your mind that a company, a board, or officers of the company should be looking at? Is there a common set of metrics out there? How do we get that transparency?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've long been concerned about using metrics because, as you know, the organization, it's just your bureaucratic inertia. Once you introduce metrics, organizations start driving and performing their tasks to the metric instead of to the actual requirement. That said, there are some very clear metrics that matter. We know they matter. Things like, and it's not how many pieces of malware you block or how many things get through. That's not a metric that really has tremendous amount of meaning. But it's, what is the state of our hygiene? How quickly are we looking for issues when issues are identified? How quickly are we patching, updating, fixing issues? Do we have visibility to do the attack detection and to respond to incidents in a timely fashion? Do we have what percentage of the accounts have different levels of privilege? And do we have the metrics around the authentication? Do we have the metrics? So I think that there are some really foundational sets of metrics we can use that would help indicate the overall health of the IT operating environment. And I think those are the types of metrics that I would focus on, but also recognize that, hey, no matter what metric you use, you're going to get it wrong, but you should be open to learning and evolving. Don't just train to the metric, train to what you think the actual task should look like.
And it's a great point, and there's no end state. And coincidentally, it sounds like a lot of the metrics and kind of, or the measurements that are important are actually related to some of the basic cybersecurity controls we talked about. So it's not too hard to kind of create that alignment and measure the right things. Because I think you're right. If you measure the wrong things, the organization will align to those things because that's how they're going to be rated from a performance perspective, and you can not get the outcomes you're looking for.
Yeah, as it turns out, the CMMC thing isn't random. There's a lot of good logic and thinking and expertise and experience behind it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. What I love about it too, when you've got a deep experience in the space, is that I think with CMMC, it feels new to a lot of people, but as you know, it really started as a voluntary requirement over a decade ago. It really was the government and industry working together. Certainly, it wasn't always perfect, but they worked together. It has been a partnership. And so we now have something that was produced, I think, collectively to be able to help industry better secure itself. And so we hear a lot about public-private partnerships, and I think CMMC is a demonstrable success of that over a long period of time. You've been involved personally with a lot of public-private partnerships. How important do you think those partnerships are in helping us raise the bar in cybersecurity?
I think it's incredibly important. The government has a lot of experience, a lot of access, a lot of insight, and is an important participant in the cybersecurity landscape. Some of the most meaningful successes in cyber, like the cybersecurity framework, even in our own field, things like CVE scores, helping to create interoperability, or CVE enumerations, interoperability between products to help enterprises really leverage and start creating platforms and start driving efficiency in R&D and in the cybersecurity market more broadly. Those are all a result of collaborative efforts between public and private sector. So there's lots of examples of how these things and where these things are working well. And I think the key is to identify for each of these efforts, who are the participants, what are they doing, what are they sharing, how are they doing it, the mechanics of those, and then ultimately, what is the value proposition for both public and private sector? And when you identify those value propositions, you can drive incredible efficiency and acceleration of capability through these partnerships. So I'm a huge fan. We just have to make sure that the ones that we develop and engage in are extremely well thought out and targeted.
Yeah, I think that's right, because time is limited. It's the resource none of us have enough of, and I think you're right. We got to make sure they're the right public-private partnerships to drive the right outcomes. Speaking of outcomes, one of the things that gets a lot of attention is attribution. So there's a lot of focus, at least in the media, on countries like China and Russia. Certainly that's, for some, that's very important to focus on. But rather than that, should there be less of a focus on the adversary and more of a focus, at least in private companies, on the things that should be getting done versus who's actually attacking who?
Yeah, and that's part of the role of government, right? There's a role for private sector and private industry here, and there's a role for government. Private industry needs to worry about cybersecurity standards, capabilities, maturity, risk management, doing the things that they need to do to manage the risks associated with their business and their business's use of technology. Role of government is to understand and enforce the rule of law. So, hey, listen, your corporation is responsible for protecting itself in cyber, but we're going to enforce law to the maximum extent possible. We're going to conduct the attack attribution. We're going to call them out. We're going to hold them accountable. We're going to respond, whether it's through cyber means or whether it's through legal action, whether it's through retorts and countermeasures, sanctions, other things. We're going to respond using every lever and branch and capability of government that we can to establish the norms of behavior from a state perspective in cyber that we want to see long term in order for society to really leverage technology.
really sounds like an extension of the public-private partnership, each party knowing what their role is and where they fall in the ecosystem. Our audience today, final question here on small business. Our audience today is largely small business. That's CMMC really. Once you get past the big primes, those names we all recognize, further down several tiers into the supply chain, the cybersecurity budget gets pretty lean at a small business. So what would you tell a small business owner or the executive team? There's so much to do. They're inundated with CMMC, the executive order, all the things they could and should be doing. Where should they start?
Yeah, well, to some of the earlier comments, I think the number one thing you start with is a commitment at the top that says cyber matters to us. That doesn't mean you have to be in the business of cyber. You've got a mission and you've got a capability that you're trying to deliver to your customer. But the integrity of your systems and your cybersecurity matters in that process. And I think ultimately that's the recognition of what CMMC brings to the table. So if it is not your core capability, then leverage the expertise that exists out there. Do it through partnership, through technology capability, through processes, through hiring, and through leveraging others in the ecosystem, which can help accelerate your journey, allow you to maintain focus on the core value drivers in your business.
I mean, this has been wonderful. I think that your ability to kind of take a very complicated topic for our audience and give them some actionable steps and ways to move forward is invaluable. So I want to thank you for your time today. And thanks so much for being a great partner with as part of CMMC Con 2021.
Eric, great catching up with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Wow, what a tremendous conversation. Thank you, Amit Yoran and Eric Noonan, for such great insight. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the conversation, so please share them using hashtag CMMCCon2021. We're now going to take a short break and start back up again at 11 o'clock, which should give you plenty of time to explore the venue. Be sure to check out all the exhibitor booths, our Black Belt Wall of Fame, and get your copy of the 2021 CMMC ebook.